Alabama 2007, cold case solved, arrest shocks community. The room had not changed in years, yet everything inside it felt altered by time. Dust had settled across each surface like a thin film of silence, muting the edges of memory. The air carried a faint scent of paper, stale and undisturbed, as if it had been trapped since the autumn night in 2007, when the case first slipped from certainty into cold archives. For a moment, standing at the entry, the investigator let the stillness pull him backward through the years, into the dim residue of a crime that had been left to sleep too long. Her name had been Mara Ellington, age 28, a quiet designer who kept to herself and lived in an older brick building on the outskirts of Montgomery. She had grown up in a small rural town north of the city, raised by a single mother, known for her patience and her gentle ability to repair small things, clocks, radios, picture frames, objects most people would replace rather than mend. She worked from home, sending her clients hand-drawn layouts and measured sketches. On weekends, she visited a nearby lake, tending to a small wooden boat her father had left behind. Those who knew her spoke softly when remembering her, recalling a person who drifted through life with cautious steadiness, never loud, never careless. The night she died, rain had fallen in small, steady drops that tapped lightly against the apartment windows. She was found just past midnight, collapsed near her desk, her final sketchbook lying open beside her. There were no signs of forced entry. No neighbors had heard anything. No weapon was recovered, and the one security camera overlooking the old building had been faulty for months. The case notes describe the scene with clipped precision, each line attempting to secure an explanation that refused to remain still. The investigator at the time, Thomas Rourke, carried an unsettling feeling that something subtle had slipped past him, something so small it evaded the framework of what they thought crime scenes should reveal. Years later, as Rourke stepped once again into the evidence room to retrieve the sealed file, that same sensation returned, a faint pressure behind the ribs, a quiet awareness of unfinished work. He walked through the narrow aisles until he reached a metal cabinet labeled 2007, unsolved. The lock resisted slightly before turning, as if it too had grown reluctant with time. Inside, her file sat precisely where he had left it, a pale manila folder, edges soft from earlier handling, its tab marked with her name in faded ink. When he lifted it, a small puff of old dust rose into the air. The weight felt unchanged, but something about it felt different, heavier perhaps, carrying a burden he had not noticed before. Rourke set the folder on the nearby table and paused. The room hummed faintly with the sound of overhead lights, the only movement in a place shaped by stillness. He opened the file carefully, page by careful page, revisiting the frozen evidence as if approaching a memory he had avoided. Photos from the scene, each rigid and silent, captured angles that neither accused nor explained. The sketchbook page displayed a half-finished design, clean lines interrupted mid-stroke. It suggested routine, not conflict. He remembered the first moment he had stood in Mara's apartment 14 years earlier, the muted colors, the faint smell of varnish, the careful arrangement of tools on her desk. Nothing had screamed danger, nothing had pleaded for help. Everything had felt preserved, as if the room itself refused to reveal what it had witnessed. And yet she had died. The autopsy report had dismissed immediate violence. No clear marks, no defensive injuries, no sign of poisoning detected under the limitations of the time. The conclusion had been inconclusive, a phrase that left the cause of her death drifting without anchor. For years he had accepted that ambiguity, though uneasily. Tonight, standing again in the dim light of the evidence room, he felt the weight of that acceptance turn inward, shaping itself into quiet regret. He looked again at a photograph captured of her desk. On the edge, barely within frame, rested a small frame containing a photo of someone blurred, barely visible. At the time, he had catalogued it without thought. Now the faint outline of that face, half-turned, felt significant in a way he couldn't yet articulate. Not an answer, just a presence he had overlooked. The air felt heavier, time felt folded in on itself. The case had remained unresolved, filed away among others that resisted closure. Yet the silence within this one felt different, more deliberate, as though it had waited for something unexpected to disturb its resting place. And something was about to. Case reopens due to discovery of new crucial evidence. The call came on a quiet Thursday morning, steady and unembellished, like most moments that had altered the course of his work. Rourke had been reviewing unrelated files when the department technician left a message on his desk, requesting his presence in the digital storage lab. Nothing urgent was written, but the handwriting carried a slight hesitation, a weight that felt familiar. When he arrived, the technician, Jonah Hale, stood beside a restored data terminal with an expression halfway between curiosity and unease. He greeted Rourke with a fragmented sentence, "I think you'll want to see this." Jonah explained that the department had been updating old digital archives, converting faulty recordings into modern formats. A series of damaged footage files from 2007 had been flagged during transfer, including those originating from the malfunctioning exterior camera near Mara Ellington's building. For years, the assumption had been that the internal damage had rendered the files useless. But during the conversion, fragments from one file began to stabilize. "We recovered a few seconds of viable footage," Jonah said, adjusting the monitor. "Not clear, not complete, but enough to matter." Rourke leaned forward, the faint hum of the machine filling the quiet. Jonah pressed play. At first, static. A frame stuttered, then another. A narrow alleyway appeared, the scene distorted but legible. The timestamp matched the night of Mara's death. Grainy shadows moved along the far edge, one figure steady approaching the building's back entrance. The face was blurred, the motion unclear, but the outline was unmistakably human. What unsettled Rourke was the subtle posture, the ambiguous pause near the stairwell, as if the person had surveyed the area before entering. The footage cut to static again. Rourke felt the cold shift of recognition, not of the figure, but of the implication. For years he had worked under the assumption that no one besides Mara had entered that building that night. This fragment disrupted that premise entirely. "Is there more?" he asked. "Only this, but it's enough to justify reopening." The moment pressed against him with quiet pressure. After 14 years, a thin sliver of digital noise had fractured the case's long stillness. Evidence did not always appear with clarity. It sometimes arrived in broken images, forcing a reevaluation of everything built on earlier assumptions. He returned to the evidence room and set the restored footage beside her old file. The combination felt like two puzzle pieces finally shifting into alignment, though the picture remained unclear. The presence of the figure suggested intent, movement, purpose. Someone had been there. He pulled out the early witness statements. Most neighbors recalled nothing unusual. One resident had mentioned seeing a car that night, not parked, just slowing near the building before moving on. The detail had been dismissed as unrelated. Now, under the weight of new evidence, even that minor remark felt different. Rourke began rebuilding a timeline, marking each known moment with slow, deliberate precision. He moved through the documents, allowing the details to breathe again in the open air. Each small fact felt sharper. The silence that once surrounded the case had been punctured, leaving room for movement. The past was no longer asleep. Something hidden had survived the years, and now it demanded examination. Investigator examines past reports to identify overlooked details. He returned to the original crime scene address. The building had aged, its red brick faded under years of southern heat. Standing at the foot of the stairwell, he exhaled slowly, letting the memory of that first night settle around him. The steps creaked the same way they always had. The metal railing still held a faint scent of rust. The corridor leading to Mara's apartment was narrow, echoing each footstep with a soft, hollow resonance. Her door, Unit 2B, was now occupied by someone else, but the interior layout remained unchanged. He stood in the hallway, remembering the smell of varnish, the faint trace of old paint that had lingered inside. The sensory memory pulled something deeper from within him, not pain, but quiet failure. He opened his notebook and began reading the old reports line by line, treating each sentence like evidence in itself. He noted minor inconsistencies, points where assumptions had filled gaps that facts had not. He circled statements too easily accepted at the time. One detail captured his attention, the sketchbook page on Mara's desk. The report had described it as a typical design draft, unfinished. But now, looking again at the photograph, the lines felt different, deliberate, cautious, as though she had paused mid-stroke not because she was interrupted, but because she had noticed something. Another overlooked detail, a call made from her phone earlier that evening. It had been logged as routine, a brief check-in with a client. But the timestamp showed a second outgoing call minutes after, one that had gone unanswered. The number was unfamiliar. It had been dismissed at the time because it led to no listed owner. He wrote it down again. He studied the witness notes, focusing on the resident who mentioned the slowing car. The description had been general, dark-colored sedan, older model. No license plate glimpsed. Yet, rereading the line, he felt a faint shift in perspective. Why had the car slowed? Why near that building specifically? And why had the neighbor remembered it at all if it seemed so ordinary? The small frame in the photo, barely visible on her desk, came back to mind. He pulled the physical item from storage. The edges had tarnished slightly, but the image inside remained intact. Mara standing beside someone whose face was partly turned away, caught mid-blink or mid-motion. A friend, a colleague, a partner. The file never clarified. The man's posture seemed familiar in the slightest, most intangible way. Rourke couldn't place it, yet the feeling persisted like a faint echo. He set the frame down gently. Each of these small fragments, an unfinished sketch, an unanswered call, a vague recollection, formed a constellation of overlooked data. None proved anything on its own, but together they created a shape he had once failed to see. He retrieved the restored footage once more, freezing the moment the shadowed figure paused at the stairwell. The posture, a slight tilt of the head, a hand in a jacket pocket, felt eerily close to the posture in the photograph. Not identical, but close enough to stir unease. He wrote a single line in his notebook. Similarity in posture, compare. He studied the scene as if reading the silence between lines. The weight of guilt was subtle but present, born not from personal wrongdoing but from the recognition of earlier blindness. The clues had been there, soft, delicate, quiet, and he had stepped past them. Now, returning with different eyes, he felt the shifts clearly. The silence of 2007 was beginning to fracture. The reopening of the case initiated a slow, deliberate widening of the circle. Names that once drifted quietly through the original report resurfaced, each now carrying the weight of possibility. Rourke proceeded methodically, letting the years-old statements breathe again, studying each line for texture, contradiction, and tone. The first name was Charles Avery, a former client of Mara's. He worked in a small contracting business, often requesting design mock-ups for renovation projects. On the surface, his involvement appeared limited: brief meetings, exchanged emails, a few revisions to projects that never fully materialized. But buried in the old notes was a passing mention, a disagreement about a deadline that never made it into the formal file. A witness had recalled seeing Charles near her building the week before her death, packing outside his truck, speaking into his phone. The neighbor hadn't thought much of it at the time, and Rourke had dismissed it then, assuming it unrelated. Now the silence surrounding that detail felt different, not incriminating, just heavier. He visited Charles at his workshop, where the man moved with slow precision, sanding a wooden frame as if shaping a distraction with his hands. When asked about Mara, his voice came out fragmented. She was good, careful. I didn't know anything had happened until later. His gaze shifted often, not evasive, but searching. He admitted to pressure around deadlines, admitted he might have seemed impatient, but insisted he never visited her building the night she died. His alibi, working late at the shop, was unverified but not impossible. Rourke left with the faint awareness that Charles carried more tension than he revealed. Not enough to accuse, not enough to clear him. The second name was Lena Moore, Mara's neighbor at the time, a quiet individual who had lived in Unit 3C. Her original statement claimed she remembered nothing unusual, but her voice, captured in an old audio log, had contained a slight catch, a hesitation that faded into the background noise of procedure. She had since moved to another part of the city, a modest single-level home with a narrow porch. When Rourke approached her, she appeared older, her posture slightly curved inward as though shielding something internal. She recognized Mara's name immediately. Her tone remained steady but carried a thin undercurrent of something unresolved. When asked again about that night, she said, "I didn't hear anything, just the rain." A pause followed. Then, "But I saw maybe a shadow at the stairwell. Could have been anyone, could have been nothing." Her uncertainty washed through the room like a cold draft. She seemed truthful, yet carried a quiet strain, as though remembering brought an echo of something she preferred remain dim. The third name emerged from the recovered phone record, the unanswered call placed in the final minutes before Mara's estimated time of death. The unfamiliar number was eventually traced to Elliot Sharp, a freelance photographer who had once collaborated with her on small creative projects. They had remained acquaintances, not close but familiar. He agreed to meet at a small cafe near downtown. His demeanor was calm, almost too controlled, each sentence structured with deliberate politeness. He explained that Mara sometimes reached out to him with questions about lighting for certain design concepts. He had missed her call that night. He said he regretted it. He had been driving, he claimed, returning from a client shoot 2 towns north. Again, not impossible. His vehicle records supported the trip, but the timeline left a narrow gap. What unsettled Rourke was the way Elliot reacted to the mention of the recovered footage. A slight stiffening in the shoulders. A pause that lasted just a breath longer than natural speech required. "Do you think it's connected?" Elliot asked, voice low. "Everything is part of the timeline," Rourke replied without revealing more. Elliot nodded, but his gaze drifted to the window, unfocused. The fourth name surfaced unexpectedly, from the faint memory of the dark sedan noted by the neighbor. Retracing vehicle registrations from 2007, near the area produced a short list of potential matches. One belonged to Victor Hale, a local delivery driver whose route occasionally passed Mara's neighborhood. He had been interviewed briefly during the first investigation because he reportedly drove past the building that night, but his presence had been chalked up to routine work. Now, Rourke sat with Victor at a weathered picnic table behind the delivery hub. Victor admitted he slowed near the building, said he had been checking an address on his route list. His explanation sounded ordinary, but a thin instability in his tone suggested he knew more about that night than he had shared. Not guilt, something more ambiguous, as though he had witnessed something unclear, something he could not articulate after so many years. One more name, faint yet persistent, returned from the edges of the original case. Caleb Rowan, a former tenant who once lived in the unit directly below Mara. He had moved out shortly after her death, claiming the atmosphere had grown uncomfortable. His old statement mentioned hearing a soft thud that evening, possibly furniture shifting. At the time, it was dismissed as irrelevant. Now, Rourke reconsidered the possibility that he had heard something more significant. Meeting Caleb proved difficult. He worked irregular hours in a job that required frequent travel. When they finally sat across from each other in a quiet lobby, Caleb's voice had a distant quality, as though he spoke through memory rather than from it. "I didn't know her well," he said. "She kept to herself. But that night there was something, a pause in the building's usual noise." He couldn't describe it further, only that it had left a feeling he hadn't been able to shake. 5 names, 5 possibilities, none strong enough to isolate, none weak enough to dismiss. Each suspect sat within the case like a muted chord, low, resonant, uncertain. Their motives ranged from pressure to familiarity to proximity, each carrying threads of potential entanglement. And yet, Rourke sensed the truth was not scattered among all of them. It was contained in one quiet detail, one subtle shift he had not yet identified. He reviewed his notes late into the night, working in the dim light of his office. The room smelled of dust and faint metal, the air weighted with concentration. Each suspect's name sat in a column, lines connecting them to fragments of evidence. The web looked complex but felt simple at its core, a single logical thread hidden beneath the tangle. He knew the next breakthrough would not come from a confession. It would come from a detail. And details rarely lied. Clues emerged slowly, linking inconsistencies to emotional conflicts. By the time morning light filtered through the blinds of the office, Rourke had already begun re-examining each page of Mara's file with renewed precision. The silence of the early hours sharpened his focus. He let the sensory details guide him, the soft scratch of his pencil as he underlined lines, the faint rustle of old paper, the subtle weight of accumulated years shaping each decision. The first clue to resurface was the unfinished sketch on Mara's desk. He enlarged the photo, tracing the incomplete lines with his finger. Something about the angle of the last stroke, slanted, hesitant, felt incongruent with her usual precision. It suggested interruption, or recognition. He revisited photographs of her workspace, letting his eyes drift to the periphery where forgotten details lived. The corner of the photo frame drew his attention again. The face partially turned, posture familiar. He compared it to the restored footage. The similarity in stance wasn't conclusive but held the quiet strength of possibility. People often carried themselves in consistent patterns, tilts of the head, subtle alignments of shoulders, rhythms of movement. He wrote another note. Identity linked through posture. The next clue came from the phone records. The unanswered call stood out now like a small pulse of urgency. Mara had reached out to someone she trusted enough to call during work hours, someone she believed might provide clarity. But why call him shortly before her death? What had she needed? And why had she abruptly stopped working on her sketch afterward? He marked a line next to Elliot's name. Purpose of final call. Cross-referencing the accounts, he noticed something subtle. Both Elliot and Charles had reasons to interact with Mara professionally. Yet their tones carried different emotional pressures. Charles with frustration about deadlines, Elliot with a controlled calm that seemed to mask something deeper. Emotional conflict often hid beneath polite sentences. He turned to Lena's statement. Her mention of seeing a shadow near the stairwell aligned with the recovered footage. Not exact, but intuitively connected. If she indeed saw a figure that night, her memory might be fractured by time but not entirely unreliable. He noted, witness memory matches footage timing. Victor's hesitation lingered in his mind. His reason for slowing the vehicle seemed thin, not false, not fully true. Sometimes people told partial truths without realizing they were doing so. His emotional distance from the event suggested he had observed something he didn't know how to interpret. Then came Caleb's comment, the sound he couldn't define, a noise that had carried through the building. It might have been nothing, or it might have been the only audible trace of the moment everything shifted. These 5 accounts created a quiet pattern, not of repeated details but of emotional impressions. Tension, hesitation, caution, the human side of evidence often more truthful than recorded statements. Rourke spread the notes before him, moving slowly, letting logic guide the connections. A timeline formed, cleaner, sharper, anchored by the recovered footage. The figure approached the building shortly before the phone call. Mara stopped working abruptly. A neighbor glimpsed movement. Another heard something faint. A car slowed outside, 5 pieces orbiting a quiet center. Then he noticed something. The timestamp of the footage didn't align with the estimated time of death by the margin he remembered. It was earlier, by nearly 20 minutes. He checked the original report. The estimation had been based on room temperature fluctuations, not direct evidence. It had been accepted because nothing contradicted it. Until now. If someone entered the building earlier than believed, the entire sequence of interactions shifted. The unfinished sketch might have occurred after she noticed someone approaching, not before. The phone call might have been her attempt to seek help or clarity. The faint noise Caleb heard might have been connected to the earlier presence. The emotional layer of the timeline changed. He closed his eyes briefly, feeling the weight of the shift. This was the kind of detail that altered everything, not dramatic, not loud, just precise. He returned to each suspect under this new light. Charles's frustration no longer aligned with the timeline. His potential motive weakened. Lena's shadow sighting gained strength. Victor's slowed vehicle matched the earlier timestamp, not the previously assumed one. Elliot's missed call now fell in a window of potential significance he hadn't acknowledged before. Caleb's faint noise became more credible. The emotional conflicts were no longer scattered. They pointed quietly toward a central pattern, one that linked personal familiarity, subtle hesitation, proximity, and timeliness. Rourke leaned back, letting the realization settle. Something small had always been there. A detail hiding in plain sight. And now, the conflict between memory, emotion, and logic had begun to converge. Rourke returned to the digital footage late that evening, letting the dim glow of the monitor fill the space around him. The recovered frames felt different now, no longer a small curiosity, but the quiet hinge on which everything turned. He slowed the clip to its lowest speed, watching the grainy figure pause at the stairwell. The posture was still blurred by distortion, but something in the movement tugged at him with increasing clarity. Not the shape of the shoulders, not the tilt of the head. Something smaller. He leaned closer. The figure reached briefly into a pocket, just a flicker, almost lost in static. But the motion was careful, practiced. A moment later, the hand emerged holding a faint glimmer of metal, then tucked it away just before ascending the stairs. A key. Someone with access. His earlier assumptions thinned, falling away quietly. Mara's circle had been small. Few had reason or ability to access her building without drawing attention. The tenants, the landlord, a handful of close contacts. He revised his notes, writing in the margin: access required, trust involved, emotional familiarity. He studied the photograph of Mara and the partially turned figure beside her. The more he compared the image to the footage, the more he noticed a quiet similarity, not in the face, which remained blurred, but in the way the right hand curved slightly inward. A subtle gesture, almost a habit. He retrieved additional case materials, documents he had once skimmed without suspicion. Among them was a brief mention of the building manager in 2007, someone who lived on site and maintained the property during the time of her death. His name, Aaron Whitlock. He had been interviewed only once, a short, routine conversation, no reported conflict with Mara, no reason to suspect involvement. He provided access to her apartment on the night she was found, unlocking the door for authorities. He attended to building maintenance quietly. His record held nothing alarming. He was, in every sense, the least suspected person. Rourke flipped through the file, searching for a photograph of him. When he found it, a staff ID picture, he felt the shift immediately. The posture, the slight inward curl of the right hand. Even in the still image, the resemblance to the figure in the footage was unmistakable once seen. He checked his earlier notes. Aaron Whitlock had been present during the early stages of the investigation, assisting with building access, answering routine questions. His statements had been brief but steady. He had described that night as quiet, uneventful. His tone on the old audio log had carried no stress, no hesitation. Yet a detail stabbed through the calm surface now. He had stated he was not near the rear stairwell, at the time the footage timestamp recorded. But the footage contradicted that entirely. Rourke felt a cold, controlled focus settle over him, the sensation of logic arranging itself in a clean line. If Aaron had access to the building, to her apartment, and had reason to be near the stairwell, what had he been doing? Why at that hour? And what connection did he have to Mara beyond maintenance? He began searching through tenant logs, building repair records, archived appointment slips. Hours passed with quiet concentration until he found the entry he needed, a work request submitted by Mara 2 weeks before her death. A simple note written in her handwriting. Door lock catching, might need adjustment. Aaron's signature confirmed he had responded. He had entered her apartment. He had tested the lock. He had been alone inside. This was no revelation by itself, but in the margin of the record, faint and nearly erased, was a second note in his handwriting. Spare key issued for follow-up. Rourke traced the words with a slow exhale. The spare key had been neither logged nor returned. He searched further: memos, maintenance receipts. A pattern emerged, small but deliberate. Aaron maintained a reserved, polite distance from most tenants but had assisted Mara more frequently than the others. Minor tasks: fixing a window latch, installing a light fixture, a replacement doorknob. Routine actions, yet together forming a line of repeated proximity. Rourke replayed the footage once more. The figure approached the entrance with familiarity, hesitation absent. Someone comfortable with the space, someone who moved with practiced rhythm. He wrote, "Familiarity can hide motive." The twist took shape not through dramatic revelation, but through small, logical alignments: posture, access, proximity, timing, unreturned key. He revisited one final overlooked detail: the faint noise heard by Caleb, the tenant below. If Aaron had confronted Mara, quietly, carefully, the sound could have been something subtle: a shift in weight, a fall, a dropped object. In the medical file, the cause of death had been labeled inconclusive, but one line mentioned low-level internal trauma possibly caused by a sudden impact, something that could occur from falling, even from a shove not intended to cause harm. Accident or intent, the timeline now circled around a single point. He located Aaron's current address, only a few miles away, still within Montgomery. Rourke visited him at dusk. The conversation unfolded slowly with fragmented speech. Aaron's hands trembled slightly as he said, "I don't know why you're asking all this again." When Rourke mentioned the recovered footage, Aaron's gaze shifted downward. A long silence followed. The air between them grew tight, controlled. Finally, Aaron whispered, "She wasn't supposed to fall." The words were soft, almost unheard. Rourke wrote them down exactly as they were spoken. The least suspected person, the quiet one, the helper, the caretaker, the observer. Logic unadorned revealed him. Ends with moral reflection. Truth isn't always visible on surface. The arrest unfolded without noise. No sirens, no spectacle. Just a quiet evening, a muted conversation, and the soft sound of handcuffs closing around wrists that once carried sets of keys instead of chains. The neighborhood watched from windows as Aaron was escorted to the vehicle. Their expressions were not of outrage or shock, more of suspended disbelief. People often believed truth revealed itself loudly, that it leapt from shadows with force. But in this case, truth emerged like dust from an old drawer, quiet, nearly invisible, yet undeniably present when caught in the right angle of light. Rourke returned to the evidence room that night. The same dust lingered along the edges of the cabinets. The air held the same old paper scent. He placed Mara's file on the table and stood there without moving, letting the weight of the case settle over him with slow gravity. He opened the sketchbook photograph once more. The unfinished lines now felt like a whisper, an interruption, a moment when she sensed something behind her. The photo frame beside it, with the turned figure, now carried a different meaning. Not a memory of companionship. A quiet warning he had not understood. He read her final call log again. She had reached out moments before everything changed. Had she sensed something? Had she suspected someone? Or had she simply wanted reassurance from someone familiar? The unanswered question pressed against him with delicate persistence. He closed the folder gently. The case had reached its procedural end. Statements written, reports finalized, evidence organized into structure. The mechanical rhythm of justice moved forward with practiced precision. But beneath the completed paperwork lay something unresolved, not in the case but in himself. He remembered her small apartment, the smell of varnish, the careful tools arranged by her desk, the world she had built with patience, a world interrupted quietly, not with violence but with an unnoticed shift in the room's balance. He imagined the moment, the quiet recognition, the sudden fall, the fragile connection between trust and danger. No dramatic struggle, no cinematic revelation, just a human moment misaligned by a fraction. Truth had not surfaced in bold strokes. It had crept forward through overlooked lines, rearranging itself through logic, not coincidence. He walked through the dim corridor of the evidence room, the lights humming softly overhead. His footsteps echoed in muted rhythm. As he locked the cabinet, he whispered, not as confession but as acknowledgement. Sometimes the quiet ones leave the deepest shadows. He paused at the doorway, looking back at the rows of closed files. Some belonged to cases that would remain unsolved, their truths buried beneath silence thicker than dust. Others, like Mara's, yielded answers only when time loosened its grip. He stepped out into the night. The street outside was calm, streetlights humming, their glow thin and steady. Justice, he knew, did not restore what was lost. It only arranged what remained. A mechanical process carrying echoes of human sorrow, trying to approximate balance. He inhaled slowly, the cool night air cutting through the weight in his chest. Truth wasn't always visible on the surface. It rarely was. Sometimes it hid in postures, in half-remembered shadows, in keys unreturned, in details so small they nearly vanished. Yet once uncovered, it changed everything. Not loudly, not completely, but undeniably. And sometimes, that quiet shift was all an investigator could hope for.